Hello, everyone. Boa tarde. I hope you had an enjoyable and productive morning, and we're delighted to kick off this afternoon's activities. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our great friend and New Cities Foundation trustee, the great architect Daniel Libeskind, who will give a keynote address before the panel, which is called Build. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. It's exciting. I learned so many things this morning. And I would like to start by saying that we are in Sao Paulo, one of the great cities in the world, but also in a building of Oscar Niemeyer, who in many ways, as an architect, created the image of Brazil. So I would like to speak a little bit about the importance of architecture and the physical space. And I start here with this curious and interesting quote by a philosopher a long time ago, St. Augustine, even though he was a theologian too. Every city is a living body, and I think that's true. But what is a body? A body is not just a physical entity. It's got the brain, it's got also the heart, and it's got the soul, because without a soul, a city or a place is really nothing. It's just material. And so that is something that I would like to share with you today. A few sort of case studies. And of course, I'm here in Sao Paulo. I'm also lucky to be building a residential tower here in this incredibly vital city that is all about transformation. Now, what does transformation mean? It means that when you are in, let's say, an old city like Milan, and this is an example of a great historical city, and we talked today, people talked very intelligently about competition between cities. Milan is a city that had in the center had a Fiera di Milano, a fairgrounds which moved out, built in the 1920s. And I became the master planner and one of the architects of what do you do with this site? The importance was to transform this site into a green space. Milan is hardscape, a lot of asphalt. A green piazza, a green public place, transportation, bringing people together and building neighborhoods that really are connected between the traditional scale of Milan and also a new scale, which is also a European scale of today. So there it is, a new site right just a few minutes from the Duomo, from the historical architecture, a city that has many, many layers of history. And I attempted to create really a new sense of vitality by bringing these historical forms into also the 21st century with 3 skyscrapers. I'm one of the architects of the skyscrapers. There are 2 other architects involved. And of course, creating residential towers, residential living in the park. Now, to create really good residential living means high density, but also something really that gives back, that creates something in the city that wasn't there before. A new sense of light, a new sense of sustainability of buildings, buildings that really have new kind of floor plates that don't only give views, but have technology that is built into the housing so that the housing becomes attractive and profitable. And I think this is important for me to say that every project that I'm showing is part of a public-private partnership. It is no longer the time where the public just invested in buildings to produce mass housing, nor is it a time just where private developers are in control. So it is always a collaborative effort to create something that has quality, diversity, intelligence, and also attractiveness, because let's not forget that the reason people come to cities are in many ways imaginary phenomena. You have to have imagination for why you want to be in a city. Cities have declined because of lack of interest in cities as well. So that is really part of the idea of developing new architecture, new sense of scale, and also a new quality of living. At the center, I propose 3 towers. One is by Hadid, one is by Isozaki from Japan. Mine is the central tower to create really a business center in the center of the city and to bring cultural activities, museum, into the center of this new neighborhood. So it is really about a creation of attractiveness, of architecture, and especially being here in a country virtually created by an architect, by the image of Brasilia, by the image of this building. I think it's very important to see the singularity of architecture as a contribution to the vitality of growth of cities. Another place, Singapore, which really I do like very much. Let's not forget that Singapore 50 years ago was not a rich country. But I had a chance to work with the public authorities at Keppel Bay, which was all industrial docklands, to create a residential project. But it's not only residential in the sense that it only is for the people who are lucky enough to live there, high density because land is very, very expensive in Singapore, but creating public amenities, walkways, extending the boardwalk, extending the sense of space by building extreme high density. And again, costs of land are very expensive, so you have to bring thousands of apartments. And the idea here is that it's not the cookie cutter approach anymore. It's not the idea of just building, extruding, building on and on. It's giving everybody an individuality. Every apartment, every unit, every sense of space should have individuality. And I think that's what people are demanding in a democratic society, that they be acknowledged as individuals and not only as piece of statistics. So as you can see here, there are many clubhouses, cafes, places for recreation, places for families. And I think that also contributes to really a new skyline of Singapore. Now, because it's so high density, I was able to leave much of that green space, which is so precious, and nature is being eroded all the time, to the public. And I think that's an important sense, that by concentrating the development in this particular sense, and these are doubly curved towers, very spectacular places because each apartment really is in a new position in space. They're not extruded buildings, which are ambitious, but I have to say that it is the authorities of planning agency in Singapore who required from the developers that if they want this density, they have to create architecture, not just numbers and not just profitability. So that is the sense, again, of creation of a community of architecture that works in synergy by also creating literally a new skyline for Singapore. I don't think any apartment buildings have been built at this height, and we received this special permission. The developers were happy to do it because we were able to maintain permeability towards Keppel Bay, create views from Mount Faber, and again, what an exemplary participation of authorities, public authorities, in planning and in architecture. So again, this is a city that was not rich 50 years ago, and yet today it is one of the most good examples of cities that are really moving forward with high aspect of living and high interest of the public authorities, how to do it profitably and urbanistically. Another project, which I call the Archipelago, in the center of Seoul, Korea, also in Asia, project to really develop a gigantic new city in a historical area. Here it is, right on the Han River, with the Nam Mountains at the back, right in the center. A site became available, the big companies, Samsung, Hyundai, all the big corporations. What do you do with this site? The site is very expensive. You have to build high, you have to build very, very dense. Here is the site. You can see that it's former railway lands. And in the 70s, you can see public housing built in a way to block the riverfront. And the idea here is the river is, like here in Sao Paulo, something precious. It's not just to be privatized by housing. It should be available to every citizen of a city. So you have this vast site, 64 acres, railway lands. You have one of the biggest stations in Korea in a historical location. What do you do? How do you create really a development here? Do you impose just a plan from New York City or from Barcelona, some successful example? Or do you really derive the plan from a historical sense of a genius loci? And that's what I believe in, that you can't just import a project from some typology abstractly existing, but have to go through the history of the place. And the history is so rich. The Shilla dynasty, which created the fantastic culture of Korea, was part of my inspiration to create this really new point of the city. And in this set of diagrams, you can see that I took sort of the idealized grid on the left, and as this grid is affected by movement, by history, by public transportation, by existing routes, by views, a project develops that becomes a kind of archipelago connected by green spaces. And I defined it by sort of the elements, the earth, the metal, the sky, the fire, the wood, the waterfront, to give a sense to each of the architects. There are more than 30 architects from around the world working on this, to create a master plan that really embraces the history of the area, connects itself to the history of the area, but also offers really green space, pleasant living, a new downtown, transportation hub. You can see that it is not an imposition of an abstraction, but really comes from within the ground. And here in this diagram, you can see there's a business center, there's a lot of housing, there's hotels, entertainment, museums, culture, the retail, one of the biggest in the world. So again, a city which is competitive in terms of its development with other great Asian cities around the corner. In this section, you can see that the city is very deep, because in order to be able to really accommodate, you have to provide parking infrastructure deep into the ground. But that gives us a chance also in these mega developments to create a new underground where we have electrical trains which connect the shopping. There is a clean transportation. You can see that all the infrastructure is just below the street, easily accessible. It's really a section of an idealized city to be built today. And again, to make all these levels of the city work, one has to work with physical models. It is a civic art, but it is an art nevertheless. Architecture is not just an abstraction. It is a sculpture. It is something in the daylight. It is something that stands out and creates this crown of innovation in the center of the city. And the retail valley, which is one of the largest shopping districts anywhere in Asia, is carved deep into the ground, has maybe 7, 10 levels below with public transport underneath it, to give public space back to the city, but at the same time to create an attraction and a vast new magnet in the very center of this capital. I'm also one of the designers of the Lantern Tower. It's one of the ecological office towers. And also, interestingly enough, I created these dancing towers, and you saw those great blocks blocking the river. This is social housing. This is not housing for the rich. And I wanted to demonstrate that with a new structure, I've got a concrete core, double fin structure, and no columns at the periphery. You can create an interesting form, which is not more expensive than those blocks. And we were able to get the residents who did not want to move from those beautiful view apartments to come into these towers, which offer certainly a much different sense of community than what was there before. The riverfront is very, very important, and creation of attractions, the ferry terminal. So that's really a work in progress, which, no, I'm not the only architect. There are about 25 others, with Renzo Piano building the big tower. But again, it shows recreation of a city in the center of the city. It's not some imaginary city. It is a city which has deep tradition and deep history. Well, rebirth is also part of what we are discussing here, because that is what cities are about. They sometimes go to sleep, but then they are reborn in an unexpected sense. And at ground zero, we all know about the tragedy that befell New York, the world, in the destruction of that site through terrorism. And I want the competition to be a master planner of what do you do? What do you do in this sense? What do you do in the center of Lower Manhattan? And I have to tell you that there were many, many ideas. The then mayor of New York wanted only low buildings, for example, no high-rise buildings. As a New Yorker, I rejected the idea. I was with most New Yorkers. You can't change the character of Manhattan because of terrorism. So I used the qualities of what I think important. It's also symbolic communication. There has to be a story told. But what I did is something rather different from all my friends and colleagues who are competitors. I did not build where everybody else built. Everybody builds mega buildings, two large towers or mega structure in the center of the site. I decided not to build anything in the center of the site. Even though the site was not declared a special site, it's still a piece of real estate, I decided you can't really build there. That should be a public space. And cities are about public space, about social place, about people coming together. So I decided one should not rebuild high-rise buildings in the center. One should leave as much of the site free for public access, for public space. So it's a 16-acre site, not very large, with 10 million square feet of office space required, 10 million. 5 million square feet of infrastructure, culture, and other facilities. We have about 18 million square feet of development, which, just to give you an idea, it's really a downtown of an average American city. Baltimore, Denver, that's the downtown right here in the 16-acre site. So not to build in the center, to bring people together, also distribute the buildings in a symbolic way, a kind of torch of liberty. Not one building, not two buildings, but as many buildings as possible so they could be lower in order to make the streets more interesting, give better perspective, avoid the wind tunnel effects and the negativity that often comes with high-rise building. You can see it here in my early sketch, the 1776 Pinnacle of the Freedom Tower, which has just been placed some days ago. And I thought it was important. It is the largest, tallest building in the hemisphere, but I didn't want it to be just the tallest, because tomorrow there'll be a taller building somewhere else. I wanted the building to have a meaning. 1776, after all, is the year of the Declaration of Independence and really the first document of human rights to the world. I thought that was an important mark of aspiration in the skyline, and then the buildings descend from the Freedom Tower around the site, creating this public space. Now, I don't show this out of vanity, but to show that how much emotion and politics is involved in bringing consensus. Let's just think of who is involved. We've got the families of the victims, thousands and thousands of people, families who lost their loved ones. We've got the Port Authority, who owns the land and leases the land to private developers and their own architects. We've got the governor of New York and New Jersey who control the Port Authority. We've got the mayor of New York in charge of the streets of New York. We've got the MTA, the subway authorities, the PATH train authorities, big organizations with a lot of power. And we've got the federal government, money also in the infrastructure. So my job, and I believe that's important in democracy, is to bring a consensus, create a plan that can move ahead, because you can have parties that initially disagree completely about what to do, share in the project. And of course, the developers originally wanted all the towers next to Wall Street, but I said no, because there's no space, there's too many shadows, narrow streets. Bring the towers towards the Hudson River where there's space, create a new neighborhood. Have a sense of the Hudson River, have a pedestrian experience at the site. Don't fill the site, create cultural emblems in the site, and create really the magnets that are necessary to tell the story both of memory, which is irretrievable of that day, but also move New York forward into the 21st century. And as someone who's the master planner, I also wrote the guidelines, the ecological and sustainability guidelines for new high-rise buildings. So for those of you who follow infrastructure, you know that there are so many levels below. 75 feet down is an entire city. And the art of creating this project is, how do you build foundations? How do you secure the site? How do you bring trains, public trains, while the site is being rebuilt? That is really the core of the project. What happens in this immense space, and how do you organize the buildings so that finally they can be a beautiful composition of buildings? The Slurry Wall is one of the organizing principles, is that huge foundation that we should have never seen. And I walked into that bedrock, and I was so moved. That's where people perished. And I thought, this wall, which is a gigantic dam, on the other side is Hudson River, had this wall fallen, all of the subways would have been flooded. And I thought, this wall, which is still the foundation of the site, should be exposed, should be part of the museum, and it will be part of the September 11th museum, which is under construction. I hope it will open next year. So the story of the site, being this deep in the bedrock of New York, which I think the visitor center will bring you down, there will be an experience that I think no one except construction workers ever had in New York City. And that is also a spiritual experience of what is the city. The city is the body and the soul. And the memorial itself, public space. As I said, I didn't build anything in the center. There's a visitor center and the footprints of where the tower stood with the names of those who perished. I wanted to create a place that is pleasant, that is interesting, that is memorable. And I also brought water. That was part of my master plan, because it's a very busy part of town. Water screens the sound of noisy street, but also brings nature into this very, very man-made area, and creates a sense of community. And I think that's the power of water, and these are waterfalls that are really immense. I was criticized in the beginning by the tabloids for bringing Niagara Falls into New York, but 7 million people have visited the memorial, and it's still a construction site. So believe me, when the site is finished, there will be millions of people. I think it will be the prime public space. And I created another public space I called the Wedge of Light from Broadway, a space determined by the times of the attack. 8:46 when the first tower collapsed, which is really defining the tower number 2, and 10:48 when the second tower collapsed. It's the center of the PATH terminal, very dramatic skylight. So again, nature is also part of memory, and I thought that is important, as well as the emblems which I used to compose the singular buildings. So I spread the density, the 10 million square feet, into as many buildings as I could, and sort of echoed the Torch of Liberty, which is just to the south of the site where it's standing. And you can see here the skyline of New York will have changed, has already changed, with the Pinnacle of 1776. Suddenly there was a change. New York was no longer this void, this sad place. And that's important, that each city has a story to tell. So the story is not always easy to tell, but you cannot unbalance the city. You cannot shift the city into a negative moment, because architecture, urban planning is about optimism. It's about giving faith, hope to new citizens, to people of New York. And you can see how quickly the buildings are going up, not quickly enough for any of us, but they are part of the economy. They come as the economy comes, and we have the Freedom Tower almost finished, tower number 4, almost finished, tower number 3, well visible, tower number 2, about to start, the PATH terminal really under construction. So it is a work in progress, and you can see that this dramatic, emblematic skyline, which it will reshape the sense of what Manhattan, what New York is really about. And I have to say, because I was an immigrant to New York City, I came, you know, I lived under a totalitarian regime in Poland under communism. That's what I wanted to bring. This is a project about people. It's not just a project about the big towers, about the beautiful architecture. I always thought, you know, my parents who worked in the sweatshops of New York, they had a tough life. My father worked as a printer right at the site. My mother was a garment worker. I thought, you know, what is the site for people of New York? They're not going to be in the offices. They're going to be in the public space. Create an incredible public space that affirms liberty, justice, freedom, and tolerance. That's what a city is about, and that's what New York is about. Thank you so much.